we are going to talk about British newspapers today, which is actually one of the most exciting opportunities that I have really uncovered in my family history research, but social history and all sorts of different aspects. We're gonna cover a lot today. And thank you very much for the introduction. I recently switched to my primary role at Find My Past. I'm now the research specialist. So I get to do research all day, every day, which is really exciting. I think one of the best things that I've ever found, though, working for Find My Past is the ability to utilize these records that come out of the UK in a way that's unique and different for those of us who have ancestry in the British Isles, but are primarily focused on our North American research, right? So one of my best finds, I think, so far to date, is the name of my fourth great grandfather. I was able to put that together thanks to Birmingham newspapers. But just last week, I actually found some more information on my Irish ancestor who spent about a decade in Wales before he immigrated to Pittsburgh. So I don't know, that might be a competition there for my favorite newspaper discovery at this point, because those Welsh newspapers are getting pretty good for me as I work through that story. So we're really going to focus today on the British Newspaper Archive, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about Find My Past, just so you understand the differences and what's going on and what's changing. The British Newspaper Archive, or BNA, as we lovingly refer to it, is the largest online collection of British and Irish historical newspapers. It is in partnership with the British Library, which is a holding library for every publication ever published in Britain, England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, but also the Commonwealth countries and the Empire countries. So essentially, it is considered a legal deposit library if it's been published under the auspices of the UK government, the British monarchy, any of those kind of ranges of leadership. And then a copy is supposed to be sent to the British Library. So it is one of the best newspaper collections in the world. And it's an absolutely delight to partner with them because they are so excited about the project just as much as we are. The newspaper collection itself is available on findmypast.com, but it's also available on a secondary website called britishnewspaperarchive.co.uk, which is what we're going to talk about the most today. Both of these sites have different search functionalities, and I think that's the biggest difference between the two. But if you happen to have a subscription, especially the top tier subscription to findmypast.com, so you can access our wonderful records from across Great Britain and Ireland, then you also have access to our newspaper collection. Conversely, of course, you can access these materials through your local library, right, such as ACPL. So today we're really going to talk about that international research, and there are a huge number of opportunities here. I've put just a few of my favorite kind of topics to research through on the slides, but think about how you can explore newspapers from around the world that isn't dependent on a name search, especially if you have a name like Smith or Brown, right? My maiden name is Brown, so I understand those struggles very much. It's difficult to search through newspaper content when you have that kind of a surname. So we're really looking at newspapers for that contextual research and that what was going on kind of viewpoint around our ancestors. So a lot of general history and world history will be included. But you also get very specific things like the discussions on passenger lists, and you'll get obituaries, you'll get celebrity events, of course, certainly coverage of global events like wars or military campaigns. And it's important to remember, too, that historically newspapers have tried to fill their columns, right? They needed to print so many pieces of paper. On the average, smallest paper was 4 pages. So a front and a back, and then a front and a back on 2 pages. They needed to fill that space to make it worth the ink and the paper, the cost of printing. So they would print stories from all over the world. So we need to keep that in mind, even though we're talking about a very UK-specific collection of papers, it really does span the news from everywhere. Okay, so we're going to start by just looking at Find My Past really quickly, because we've done a lot of work in this area over the last couple of months, but in just the last 15 days, the search functionality on the Find My Past website for our newspaper collection has changed drastically. So we've done a lot of updates on our search platform here. And it is actually, at this point, I kind of think that it is superior to the search on British Newspaper Archive. Now, if you had asked me that question 2 months ago, I would have told you that BNA is by far the better search. in terms of the technology and the results that you get back. But today I'm changing my tune because the developments that they've made on the Find My Past newspaper search tool is actually really exciting, and I'm really having a lot of fun playing around with the new tools. So this is what it looks like when you go to the newspaper collection on Find My Past. The picture in the background is actually part of the collection at the Boston Spa facility, which is in York. This is part of the National Newspaper Archive building. It's all robotic and it's motorized. If you haven't seen this facility before, go onto YouTube and just Google, Boston Spa newspaper building. You will find video of how their robots work, and they retract the collection and the original materials off the shelves. It's fascinating. It's really cool to watch. But anyway, I digress. This is the search screen. This is kind of the basic entry into the search. If you scroll down on this page, what you get is kind of a series of tools and suggestions and some how-to tidbits. This is really helpful, especially because we have just made these big updates. If you click on this little link at the top that says View All Search Tips, you'll get into a blog post on the Find My Past blog that tells you all about the kind of best practices for newspaper research. And actually, there are a couple of videos linked there as well that talk about the Boston Spa facility. They also talk about OCR technology and how the newspapers actually get online in the first place, which to me is very useful information because it helps me inform how I'm going to actually conduct my searches, right? If I know how the newspaper was digitized and the barriers that exist, then I can conduct a better search and I can be more intelligent about how I'm actually going about that. There's also a brand new advanced search on Find My Past. For the newspaper content specifically, I've had to break it into two pieces because it's a pretty big screen. There's a lot of options now. You can, of course, search by name, but you can now search by multiple names, which you weren't able to do before. The flexibility on the date ranges is a lot better. And you can also search by phrases, and you can specify keywords and you can prioritize keywords. It's all actually really quite exciting to see these advancements pop up. So if you are looking for more information on the Find My Past search functionality, again, I recommend that blog post is a great way to get started, but play around with the new search functionality. I think that if you haven't looked at Find My Past newspapers for a while, I think you'll be very, very surprised and happily so. I'm very pleased with the work that we've done. Okay, so let's get into then the meat of what we're going to talk about today, which is the British Newspaper Archive. So it is, like I mentioned, kind of a secondary site. It is hosted in its own domain, but it is owned by Find My Past. So it is britishnewspaperarchive.co.uk. If you just use your favorite search engine and type in British Newspaper Archive, you'll find it. But just to note that it is a .co.uk domain, not .com. The British Newspaper Archive covers local, national, international news from the 1700s forward. Like I mentioned, it is a partnership with the British Library and then a handful of other publishers across the United Kingdom to fill in the gaps where British Library collection is not quite complete. We launched this project in 2011. We had an initial timeline of 10 years and 40 million pages. That contract was extended in 2021, and we are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 million pages of newspaper print on the website. We are scanning at their facility in York. We actually have a scanning team in the basement of their newspaper storage building. So we are right there with the British Library team on site. The newspaper titles that you'll see on the site are kind of all over the board. You'll get these general titles that really just talk about news in general, the Daily Mail, right? Or specific titles from different locations, different counties. But you'll also get some wonderful, really unique niche titles. So there's titles about cinema, sport, horse racing. There are newspaper titles about, women's magazines and women's titles. It's anything you can think of really is available through the archive. It's really fantastic. And as I mentioned, of course, it covers everywhere that the British Empire at some point touched. So when you think about the British diaspora, you're really thinking about early American colonies. You're thinking about South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, obviously South America, India. So you'll see a number of newspapers from really kind of all over the globe. So again, when we're looking at search strategies, we're really thinking big, right? We're thinking about keywords, geography, the type of article that we're looking for. We're going to search by county before we search by town, and make sure that we're kind of keeping our options open, right? If you go too narrow too fast, just like on any other kind of genealogy service provider website, you want to make sure that you are giving yourself the opportunity to see and find everything. So don't get too specific too quickly, right? Fill in your search boxes kind of slowly and build up. We're definitely going to want to make sure that we utilize the advanced search functionality. And then, of course, on BNA, we have the option of searching by region. We will try all of these things to make sure that we're finding the newspaper coverage that we can find, right? Finding everything that we can see. So when you open British Newspaper Archive, this is what the website looks like. This is kind of our homepage. And there are a variety of search options. You see those just directly underneath the search box. You can enter into the website and start searching in whatever way pleases you, but we'll kind of walk through a couple of these today. Each of them have their own individual benefits. The advanced search option is just to the right-hand side. It's that big white button. You can't really miss it, but we'll walk through those as well. I just do like to point it out to make sure that people are aware of how to navigate around the homepage, because that's always useful. Right, so basic search results. I searched just on the keyword silversmith. And of course you get, a number of results, but there are a lot of features here that we're going to kind of walk through and make sure that we're aware of. First, I have the option to keep these results or to select an exact search. So let's say that I wanted to add to this. I want to say silversmith in Birmingham. If I check the keep filters box, then that will keep the silversmith part and add Birmingham. If I don't check that box, then it will just start searching for Birmingham, and it will drop the silversmith. Also, of course, selecting the exact search means that it will search across that exact phrase. So silversmith, Birmingham. If the words don't show up in the newspaper article in that exact order, then I will not get that as a search result. So there are good ways and bad ways to use exact search, right? So if you're searching for a name in particular, an exact search can be really helpful. You can also change the order in which the results show up. So I can change it by relevance. I can change it to the earliest newspapers first or the newest newspapers first, depending on how and what I'm looking for. I can save the search in my profile as long as I'm logged into an account. And that then, of course, allows me to go back in 6 months. I can run the exact same search again and find all the new material that we've published and made available in that time frame. So a lot of tools that you can utilize. Now, the main part of the search functionality is actually running down the left-hand side of the screen. And that is all of those various search filters that are available for you. So I want to walk through those. Now, some of them you're going to be very familiar with and you're going to know immediately, but some of them are a little bit more unique and they get quite specific. So the likely most prominent filters you'll find yourself using are things like the date ranges, maybe the title of the newspaper if you're interested in a particular location, or the country, for example, or maybe the county that you're working through. But there are a number of other search filters that we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of. So the regions, the counties, the place itself, right, where the newspaper is actually printed from. So you see London on that column, but you also see Sheffield in York. The type of article that you get back. So there are a number of ways to approach that. But let's just say, for example, you only want to get advertisements because you're looking for a business. I actually did this for a colleague this morning. He was looking for the name of a business that he found in the 1921 census of England and Wales. We selected the search. We selected advertisements only. We found it right away. There's also search filters for materials that have been recently added to the site. So if you're a regular user of BNA, you can go back and say, I just want to look at what's been added in the last 30 days or even just today. And we do add content on a nearly daily basis. And then there is a section for public tags. And that is our users like you all coming in and saying, this article is an illustration and tagging it as such so that other people can find it. So a lot of search options. The idea here with all of these filters is that you are in control. You know what you're searching, what you're looking for, what you're hoping to find. And the computer can help you with that, but it can only do so much. So we try to put you in the driver's seat and make sure that you are getting back the most relevant results that we can possibly offer. That's our goal, which is why we give you so many things to search on and so many different ways to search so that you can actually control that search in a very specific way. So let's just kind of look at how these all work together just very quickly. So we're just going to use the date filter as our example. So I can refine the dates by first in half-century increments. So 1700 to 1749, 1750 to 1759, et cetera. So I can search my my half century, and then I narrow down to the decade. We see that kind of coming across. And of course, all of those filters are being kept on the top of our screen, so we know exactly where we're at. And then I can go to a specific year, and then a specific month, and then a specific week, and then finally to a specific day. And what I end up with is a list of newspapers that are available to me that actually include my search term on that exact day, the 10th of August, 1826. There are 9 results. If I click on this little more newspapers down here, it opens in a pop-up window, and that gives me all of the titles that are available on my search. So on that very specific day, for that very specific keyword search, I have 9 possible newspaper options to look at. And of course, this may change in a month because we add content all the time. So it's a really easy way to track. I've seen that newspaper. I need to go to something that I haven't seen before. So then, of course, you get into your results page. We've looked at silversmiths on a very specific day. And you'll see down the left-hand side now that everything is just London, right? That's the newspaper I've selected. I'm looking specifically at the Morning Advertiser. All of this kind of happens automatically as you filter and you work through your search. So you know exactly what, when, and where this newspaper result is coming to you from. When you open one of these newspaper images, this is what it currently looks like. Although, you know, with all the work we've been doing on our newspapers, I can't promise it will look like this in 6 months. I'm not sure. There's a lot of development happening. But you do get the full page of the newspaper print. You get the search results are highlighted in a little blue box. The OCR text is running down the left-hand side. So if you wanted to copy and paste that into a Word document or manipulate that in some way, you can certainly do that. And then, of course, the name and data about the newspaper itself is at the top. So this is the Morning Advertiser on the 10th of August, 1826. This is page 3 out of 4. It's produced by and on behalf of the British Library. So they are the copyright holders on this particular title. And then if we zoom in, we can find our search. This is me looking for that silversmith. So it's actually hyphenated. You see that from the first line into the second. And this is where that search result came from. Okay, so that's kind of the basic setup for searching on BNA. There are a number of other features available to us. And one of my favorites is the map. If you go to the homepage on the British Newspaper Archive and you scroll down a little bit, you will see this little map. It doesn't look very fancy, but this is interactive. So when you click on any one of these regions, it will come up and search just those papers. So let's take kind of a bigger look. If I hover over the region of West Midlands, that's where I get that little label bubble that pops up on the map. The regions are quite specific. So Ireland has 2 regions, Northern Ireland and then the Republic of Ireland. Wales has the 4, North, Mid, West, and South. Scotland has a handful, of course, largely based on counties, but some of them are combined. And then England has kind of our standard regions that you might find on a number of different websites about England. So each English region has multiple counties in it, except for London, which is specifically just London newspapers. This can be super helpful if you are unfamiliar with the geography or you're not exactly sure where your ancestor was, or maybe they were agricultural laborers and they moved around seasonally and you're trying to get an understanding of what was happening in each of those different villages or parishes as they move through their lifetime. This can be really exceptionally helpful. So in this case, we're going to look in the West Midlands. Still thinking about my silversmith ancestor in Birmingham. When I click on West Midlands, I automatically get redirected into a search screen that has all of the newspaper content, but just from the West Midlands. So you can see that there are a number of papers listed, and that list continues, right? There's actually quite a lot of them, but it is pre-populated for me. I don't have to go through and make sure that I am getting all of the titles that are from that area. It's all done as part of that kind of that map interface. So again, if you're kind of just getting started in newspaper research in the UK, or you're really not sure where they moved around to, or maybe you can't find where they died, this is a great way to kind of approach that research. So as we continue to look through the collection, we can narrow down our search terms again and decide what we're interested in. We can play around with that, keep filters and that exact search functionality. I am at this point changing to the surname of Lawrence. So my silversmith, I'm pretty sure, was a man named John Lawrence. So I'm going to search for him in this region specifically in a very specific time frame and hope that I get some good results. Now we can also use wildcards on BNA. So in this case, I'm searching for LA question mark, RENCE, because you can spell Lawrence in multiple ways. It could be a W, it could be an AU, and I don't know. Maybe there are newspaper editors that just spell it one way and, and himself that spells it a different way. So you're not really sure how to approach that. Wildcards are totally appropriate on the BNA search, and I highly recommend that you use them in just about every case. And you can use the question mark to replace one character and get a number of results. If you use an asterisk, it will replace multiple characters. So you can use an asterisk in a variety of functions as well. And that's available on most genealogy websites, but certainly on Find My Past and British Newspaper Archive. Now, in this case, we've filtered down again to our dates, and we're able to see that we have a number of results. We can see those wildcards kind of in action here. Here's a great example. This is a very early paper where the S looks like an F to us, right? And so in the word East Indies, it actually looks like EAFT, but that's the way it was printed in the time period. You see another example here where they're using the word Pennsylvania, right? That F looks like an S, or the double S is represented as an F. This is where wildcards and asterisks and question marks really come in handy, is especially in these older papers. Okay, let's talk about the content then and what we can actually find. As I mentioned at the top of our discussion today, we do have newspapers from across the empire. So I really want to focus on some of those and tell you how to get into them. But I also want to show you the kinds of things that you can find through these newspaper collections. So this is just a handful of the titles that we have available. We actually added more material to the Uganda Herald just yesterday and today. So you guys are literally the first people to know that collection's been updated. But we do have collections from Canada, India, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, Belize, Australia, New Zealand. We do have some very early papers from the United States, but of course, they would have been British colonies at that point. As soon as the Revolutionary War starts, then the colonies stop sending their newspapers back home to Britain to be stored and kept, because of course they're not part of the empire at that point. But that doesn't mean that you cannot find American information in these papers. So how do we access these international titles on BNA in particular? If you go into the advanced search screen, you can use this drop down on publication titles and just look for them by name. You can also access them through the newspaper's titles page. You can type in the search box. So in this case, I'm looking for Hamilton, which is the Hamilton, Canada newspapers. So we've got the Hamilton Advertiser, the Daily Times, and the Herald, and Lancashire Weekly News, which is obviously out of the UK. The URL specifically for this page is britishnewspaperarchive.co.uk/titles. And that will get you directly into this landing page that gives you the chance to kind of search in a big screen all of the available, all of the titles on the collection, not just the international ones, but everywhere. Okay. So once you get into these international newspapers, what can we expect to find, right? So all sorts of information. The Australian and New Zealand Gazette from March 22nd, 1870 really is featuring kind of this section of home intelligence. They're actually talking about who was being transported on which boat, who was going back and forth to England, who was doing business, right? So they're naming people in particular, and also the vessels that they sailed on. We also get all sorts of international news, right? So the Toronto Daily Mail on April 30th in 1890 published this column on German gossip, and they're actually talking about a forbidden marriage in Germany. So this was essentially international gossip, right? If we think about like in today's terms, I suppose something equivalent might be like news with the Kardashians, but I don't really know that much about them. But it would be covered by everybody, right? It would be covered by all the papers, and that's true historically as well. We can also find vital events. This is the Wishaw Press from 1925, where they published the birth of a daughter to Mr. and Mrs. Neil Aitken of Chicago. That is, it's a very short entry, but you can kind of assume at this point that the Aitken family probably has some connection back to this area in England. One of my favorite examples is this article about a death in Akron, Ohio. A woman named Mrs. Floyd was formerly from Cornwall. And so the Cornishman published a full obituary for her on the 4th of May, 1939. In this article, we get her maiden name, the details of her early marriage, her birth date and location, the funeral and cemetery information, the family members that attended. We also get this huge list of mourners. That's part of her fan club and important and essential research for us. We get social content. And then finally, in the last paragraph, we actually get the name of her spouse. And then her son as well. So there's family information there. This is all, of course, printed in a British newspaper, right? The Aberdeen Press and Journal covered the death of Mrs. Rattray on the 2nd of June, 1923. She also, of course, would have had a connection back to that location at some point. And it actually indicates that in that last paragraph there at the bottom, about 20 years ago, she married and immigrated to Canada. And it was while visiting the old country on a holiday that she died. So she actually is a resident of Canada, but dies in Aberdeen. We also get lovely occupational information. So I've already mentioned my example of the silversmith. This is the family oral history that has been passed down to me that I have been working from. This is why I think that he was the son of a silversmith. So this is basically memoirs that were documented by John Horatio Lawrence's spouse. And she sat down with one of her daughters in the early 1900s and wrote all of this down and talked about the family. So by memory, she is saying that John Horatio Lawrence was the son of a silversmith of the English middle class. And I kind of set out to go, how can I possibly find this? What can I do to identify silversmiths in the Birmingham area in the English middle class, in the early 1800s? How am I going to narrow this down? And actually, the newspapers were a huge help. So in the 8th of August, 1831 copy of Ayres's Birmingham Gazette is where I found my first result. And it mentions Mr. Lawrence, a silversmith of this town, and he's obtained a patent. I've actually gotten a copy of that patent now, and it's essentially a seatbelt for a horse saddle that literally goes underneath the belly of the horse and connects through this little mechanism that he designed and created. I don't think it was very successful. It didn't really go very far, but I do have a copy of the patent details. As I continued to search through this particular title, I found all sorts of information that, he, at one point, his business was not doing well. He ended up going to auction and selling things off. He actually was a victim of a robbery at one point, and there was a number of articles about that court case and seeking out the criminal involved. All sorts of wonderful information, just based on some, very vague family history. We also, of course, get a lot of military and war news, again, from just all over the world, but looking specifically at some North American events. The coverage of the War of 1812, as we know it, and also the American Civil War in UK newspapers is extremely thorough. I have found a number of articles, especially about the Civil War, that are printed in a great amount of detail. And that is because, in many cases, because Britain had a financial investment in the cotton industry at that point. And of course, the American Civil War had great implications to the American cotton industry. So Britain was following that war very, very carefully. If we go back in time a little bit, this particular article from the Lancaster Gazette is covering a trial of an American major general from the War of 1812. Now, we know it as the War of 1812, but in the UK, it would have been part of the larger Napoleonic Wars. So this is just kind of a carry forward, right? And not just yet another year of military engagement kind of around the world for the British Army. And that's how they would have perceived this. So understanding the context of the article that you find is also important, right? Knowing that at this point, England is pretty exhausted by war, and they have been at war for a number of years. So this little tiny War of 1812 engagement in the United States that was quite important for us is just part of a longer chain of events for them. But they're still covering kind of all of that news that's coming out of America and Canada in particular. I talked about this a little bit already, but the American Civil War was heavily covered by UK newspapers. And you can definitely see their political leanings. Although England officially remained neutral during the war, certain areas of the country were much more invested than others, right? Liverpool, Manchester area, where the cotton industry was really the biggest, was predominantly pro-Confederate, although they were probably pretty quiet about that. But they wanted the cotton trade to continue in the way that it had been functioning for a long time. So this September 1863 article from the Liverpool Daily Post, where it actually is condemning the behavior of some Confederate soldiers, or rather the Confederate officers, is actually a relatively rare find for this particular newspaper. They were pretty heavily pro-Confederate because of that cotton industry. So keeping that in mind, and again, kind of knowing that context of what the newspaper would have been for and against, and because of course no news outlet is completely neutral and never has been. So keeping that in mind and understanding that context continues to be important all the way to modern day. This one was quite interesting, actually. This is from the Jedburgh Gazette. This is 1947. So we're jumping forward to World War II here, but this is a military history. It's a letter that was sent in by a resident of Canada. The individual who wrote the letter is basically writing a letter to the editor. He has memories of his father included in this letter, but also the military history of his son. So we actually get three generations of this family because he wrote this letter to an editor to a newspaper in the UK from his home in Montreal. We get a lot of information, especially from World War I and World War II, as the US and the UK start to develop into historically more of an allyship than enemies or kind of frenemies, if you will. They become stronger and stronger allies, and we start to see a lot more information as we get into that kind of that more modern period. So war bride stories like this one from Lincolnshire are really popular. This is another one that it's talking about how she had come back from Canada after being gone for 24 years. She was a war bride herself. And in the article, she actually talks about how far advanced they were in terms of television, that they didn't have TV in all the houses in Canada in her town yet, but they all had them in Hastings. The social history opportunities are through the roof here in the UK papers. You get full page spreads on various topics that are important around the world. So this one from the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News, which is not necessarily where I would expect to find a 2-page spread on women farming during World War II, but that's where it was. This one in particular was of interest to me because my grandparents were dairy farmers during World War II. And that's exactly what they're talking about, is women stepping up and kind of running the farms across the United States. And they're actually showing pictures of milking cows and things. So of course, this one was appealing to me. But this one is maybe my favorite ever. And this is a very flamboyant story. This is from a paper in 1902, June of 1902. And it includes the name of my hometown. I grew up in a very small town in Washington State, the town of Enumclaw. So there's only one of them in the world. So I know when I see it that it is my town. And this very small article talks about this fire that was blazing through the town. And if you read through this, it talks about how the train is racing to escape the fire. They've got the women and children on board, blazing forest. The passengers are nearly suffocating. Women are fainting, and the fire continues. I have looked for actually a couple of years now for a replica of this article. I have only found it mentioned in one other place, and that is another British newspaper. I have never found mention of this in an American newspaper anywhere. Now, a part of that is because the newspaper from the local community is not digitized and available for me to search online. I'd have to go back to Washington and do some researching there. So I'm sure it's covered in those papers, but it's not available online to me yet. Turns out, if you email the local historical society, this fire wasn't really that big of a deal. And this story is just a wee bit exaggerated. By that, I mean a lot exaggerated. But it is a great way to kind of explore the history of a community, especially with something like a unique keyword that you can search on, and finding those opportunities to really kind of delve into those stories. This is just absolutely one of my favorites, I think, of all time, anywhere, ever, on any of my research. Now, if we get into kind of some more specific topics, right? Immigration, of course, is heavily covered. Canadian immigration, they're talking in this particular piece from Lloyd's List in 1910, they're actually talking about a change in policy from Canada and how immigrants are need to be prepared to enter the country, right? They now have to have £5 in cash. And if they don't have that, they will be turned around and sent back to the country they came from. If we go back in time a little bit to 1836, we see advertisements for land companies who are actually recruiting people to come and immigrate into Canada, into the United States, into Australia and New Zealand, really all over the place. And if we jump back even another century, the Ipswich Journal tells us on the 23rd of June that there was a report of a ship from London, from Rotterdam, passed by Dover last Monday with 150 immigrants headed to settle in Pennsylvania in a new colony next to that of the Swiss. This kind of material for our immigrant ancestors, I think, can be really invaluable. One more example of this comes from the Liverpool Mercury. This is the 13th of November, 1863. It's talking about the ship Universe, which left for New York at exactly 8:30 a.m. on the 10th. It was pulled out of port by the tug United Kingdom, and they left with a fresh breeze to the wind, or a fresh breeze to the northeast. This vessel carried my ancestor, Daniel McNamara, from Liverpool to New York. He ended up settling outside of Pittsburgh. These are my Irish ancestors, so notoriously difficult to trace, but because I know what vessel they were on, thanks to passenger lists, I can then go back to the newspapers and I can find that voyage. I also have the newspaper entry from the New York Times that describes what happened on the ship when they actually arrived in New York. And it turns out that there was a baby born on this voyage, and one of the crewmen died as a result of falling off one of the masts during a storm. So while they left with a nice fresh breeze on what sounds like a lovely day, they actually had quite a tumultuous journey in many ways. And that allows me to tell a much more detailed story of Daniel McNamara's voyage from one place to the next. And it's quite an interesting way to add context and color to your family tree. So when we talk about color, we definitely want to talk about family legends, those skeletons in the closet. There are all sorts of these, of course, across newspaper content. 1915 Lurgan Mail talking about a long lost father and an uncle from America. It turns out this guy was running a scam. He had come over to the UK to literally try and scam women out of money by pretending that he was this long lost relative and they needed to help take care of him. We also get lovely stories that we can then back up with historical research and documentation. So this is another really good one of my favorites. This is from 1936, the Dundee Evening Telegraph, talking about a woman named Kate Anson Rattray, who's a resident of Dundee. She married Alexander on the 2nd of June, 1905, and the very next day he left for Canada. The last letter that she received from him was the 23rd of December, 1905, so just a few months later. Had not heard from him again ever, all the way up through 1936. In July of 1934, an American company seeks out a life insurance policy against Alexander, and the claim against that policy was filed by his second wife, who he married in 1909, just 4 years after he left, and then deserted her in 1922. So when I found this, my objective was to kind of go, well, how much of this is actually true, right? These are some big claims being made in a newspaper article. How much of this can we verify? Well, we can find Alexander leaving on the Corinthian on the day that they reported that he left, the very day after he got married. He lists himself as single, age 24, as a farm servant. He is headed to he's going from Glasgow to Quebec with plans to finish up at Niagara Falls. We find him in the Canadian census in 1911. He does have a second wife. They do have a daughter named Annie. So he is bigamously married at this point. In June of 1914, we find him in border crossing records. He does list a wife named Margaret. He lists his occupation as bricklayer, and he identifies his residency as Niagara Falls of New York as his permanent residency. We see him again crossing the border in October of 1920, again listing his wife, and his intention is to head to Florida, to Jacksonville, Florida, to make his permanent residence. And actually, if you continue the story, you'll find that that is where he dies in the census records. In 1920, he's with his wife Margaret, but eventually they end up alone in census records, and then of course he dies, and this insurance claim is filed. They have to go to both spouses, right, to process that insurance claim, and so it ends up in the local paper in Scotland. So everything in that newspaper article is basically true. We can look for natural disasters and what would have impacted our ancestors in certainly a global perspective, right? So things like volcanic eruptions that left these clouds of ash, kind of traveling all over the globe. That certainly would have been universal coverage across newspapers, but also things that are very specific to North American history. So the Dust Bowl was covered heavily in newspapers across the UK, and it was covered while it was happening, but then they also covered it as they learned more about it after it was over. So you see this article from the Scotsman all the way up to 1950, and they're actually saying we're fearful of another Dust Bowl type event. And this is, of course, post World War II. So you're seeing these events kind of covered in these papers, kind of no matter when and where. Now, it's important, we talked about context a little bit, but it's also important to learn the language. It's not just the act of finding the article, but also interpreting that article. So we can look to some of our revolutionary history for this, for a great example of this. The word patriot took on a whole new meaning during the American Revolution for the British in particular. Americans tended to use that word as a compliment, right? It was, you were a hero, you were someone who was acting on behalf of the colonies. But in Britain, that word was seen as more of an insult or a slur. So understanding that language really helps us understand the article, right? So in this case, this is a copy of an extract of a letter from Virginia, and they're talking about the patriot, Captain Trenchard, but they are using that word in an insulting way. So when we read that, we might see it with one perspective, but it's important to understand the context with which it was printed. Here's one more just quick example. They're again talking about a certain patriot in America, and they're actually talking about kind of gossip and letters that have been released with military intelligence in them. This certain patriot in America, and how he was describing kind of military actions, that those letters had been intercepted. And just a very quick little snippet that gives you quite a bit of context in terms of how that individual was seen in the UK versus in the United States. Now, how do we understand that terminology? Where do we get that from? Well, one way is just to simply learn about the historical period in which you're researching, right? You read a lot. So authors note these kinds of nuances when they're discussing the topic. The quote that you're looking at is from an author named Nick Bunker in his work, An Empire on the Edge, How Britain Came to Fight in America, where he generally presents the argument that if people on both sides of the revolution had sat down in the same room and actually asked each other, what do you mean by that term when you say that, that they may not have ever gone to war, because the language had changed so much by that time that they were literally not understanding each other and they were misinterpreting what they were saying. And his argument is that the war may not have ever happened if they had kind of gotten together and been very clear about their communication. So one way of understanding those nuances is simply to just educate yourself about the period and the people in which you're working. We can also, though, utilize technology to help us understand some of these word uses, right? So if you look at Google Books, they have a tool called the RAM viewer. And what that does is actually it rates the number of times in which a particular word is used in all published books that are available across the Google Books collection. So I looked for the words patriot, loyalist, Tory, and Tories, which are four very common words during the American Revolution period. But you see in published works that there is a peak leading up to about 1740. There's another peak around the 1780s, which aligns with the war. And then use of those terms all drop down again until the 1840s when it peaks, and then it kind of remains consistent, but then gets into more organized politics in the UK. So we can infer from this, and we see this peak here in the 1840s, that there are a number of people writing about these topics and these issues during these periods and publishing their work, whether it's newspapers or books or published works or periodicals. But then again, we see a resurgence of that in the 1840s, and that is probably people writing about the Revolutionary War and using these same terminologies. And we also have a lot of political things happening in the UK in the 1840s, so it could relate to that as well. But this is an opportunity and a tool for us to see which words we need to be using. What keywords should I be searching newspapers for? This type of tool will help us understand that. If we then go into a little bit more detail in these publications, we can see that the use of the word Tory is particularly dominant during 1840 to 1885. If you click on that year range, then it will take you into a list of results of titles that use the word Tory that are published during that time frame. So in this collection of titles, we're able to then find different publications that talk about or use the word Tory. So this is actually a collection of poems and songs that were sung around the campfires during the American Revolution. And they, of course, use the word Tory. So this is actually an incredible way to provide context and to bring some of that social history, some of those alternate sources into our family history so that we can really delve into that material in a more meaningful way, right? And again, offers those keywords for searches across newspapers. Okay, so very quick recap. We want to make sure that we're searching a variety of names and spellings. Be willing to search through newspapers from a broad area around your main location, whether that is UK or somewhere else in the world. Think about how to search broadly. You want to make sure that you're interpreting your findings to ensure you're applying the right information with the right context for the time frame that you're working in. We definitely want to utilize different search techniques to identify newspapers of interest, right? Especially if you have a migration pattern where you have a number of people from a village that migrated into Michigan, or you have a number of people who ended up in a farm around Omaha or a farming community. That newspaper in particular is probably going to cover that community and those immigrants in a more detailed way. You can utilize both the Find My Past search and the British Newspaper Archive search. I typically use them in tandem, but again, lots of changes to the Find My Past search system at this point. And then, of course, there are lots of tools online to take advantage of. The Find My Past forum on Facebook, if you're a Facebook user, is one of those. It's a great place to ask questions and get clarification on things and actually talk to people who are studying history and genealogy that are in the UK. So you can get some of that kind of vernacular and some of those cultural pieces kind of in your mind. Just one last couple comments, right? Is to just make sure that you are ready for just about anything, right? I tend to do a lot of American Revolution research. So I was looking at the topic of tea during the American Revolution, right? Which is, of course, a big topic at the time. So I was searching all sorts of different keywords, and I found that, of course, during the Stamp Act, to fight the Stamp Act, they started making tea from Indian corn. And so there's actually a little bit of information about that in one of these UK papers, and kind of gave me some perspective in it, and almost a recipe further down in the article about how to actually use corn to make tea. I can't imagine it tasted anything similar or anything alike. And then, of course, you don't know what you're going to get, right? So I've been looking for the colonies in America, and I end up with the choicest colonial wines from Robert Miller and Son in Ipswich. So you just never know what you're going to come up with, but all of it is a learning opportunity, and all of it is a wonderful opportunity for research. So I think that brings us to our conclusion today.